Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's wonderful to have all of you join us for World Review, our weekly news weekly view at the news from around the world. And joining us this week is Carla Robbins, adjunct senior fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Carla, wonderful to have you back.
Thanks, Ivo.
Also with us, Peter Spiegel, you as managing editor of the Financial Times. Great to see you again, Peter.
Thanks for having me back, Ivo.
And for the first time, Giles Whittell of Tortoise Media and formerly of the London Times, where he was at once a correspondent in Washington. Giles, wonderful to have you join us here today. And you need to mute your button, then we can all hear you.
There we go. Thanks.
Let me start with you, Giles. The big news of the week is the spike of COVID in Europe and indeed in the United States. Here in the Midwest, we are seeing the cases rise above the numbers that we saw in the spring in places like France, of course, in Spain, in the UK, where you are, but also in Germany and Italy, and as I said, here in the Midwest. 100,000 plus cases in Europe just every day here. It's really astonishing what's happening in Europe in terms of the cases, but more importantly, what's happening in how governments are responding to it.
Well, thanks, Ivo. Thanks for having me. I think what's really interesting is that what's happening, it's not uniform, but it's similar across a very variegated landscape, but the political impact, we can get to the economic impact later, but the political impact is so varied. So as you say, if we talk in terms of rolling averages, we're now upwards of 100,000 new cases per day across Europe. That accounts for more than a third of all new cases globally. As the Journal reported earlier this week, Europe overtook the US in terms of cases per 100,000, cases per million earlier this week. That line has shot up very, very steeply over the past few weeks. And it's not a mystery why. We probably don't have time, but I know why. For one day, I was in Saint-Tropez this summer. I was dragged there by one of my kids, right? And we went from the beach to downtown. And this was at a time, 2 days later, we found out that we were at the European epicenter of infection. And you could see why. You could see why. Europe at play on the beach in total denial. And what seems to have happened, if I can extrapolate the epidemiology from that, is young people caught it, many of them asymptomatic, went back to Paris and have spread it like crazy. And we're now seeing the knock-on effects. And the political impact has been fascinating because it has been chaotic. It has been jerky. In Spain, you've had the city of Madrid suing to keep its businesses open. In Berlin, you've had Merkel arguing with regional governments over the details of regional lockdowns. In Paris, Macron just came out and said, right, we have a 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew in 8 cities. We have a state of health emergency, like it or lump it. This is serious. We have failed. He did take issue with an assessment out of control, but there was an element of leveling with the French people. And here in the UK, it's been a continuation of a story of confusion. Boris Johnson this week introduced a new 3-tier system of alerts. But what's really interesting to me is that if you map the sudden increase in caseloads in most of the 27 countries of the EU plus the UK, everyone, including really interestingly Eastern Europe, Czech Republic and Slovakia, which got through the first wave with almost with minimal infection and death rates. They're now facing a really serious second wave. But in those countries that have been able to maintain the trust, broadly speaking, of voters, they're on side. France has done scarcely any better than the UK in handling this pandemic. But on a last I saw, roughly 70% of voters back the latest measures that Macron has taken. Here, Johnson has seen his personal approval ratings, those of his party, collapse over the course of the past year. I see no sign of picking up. And just finally, contrast Scotland and England. Again, the per capita levels of infections and deaths north of the border are very similar to south of the border. But Nicola Sturgeon, the nationalist leader there, the First Minister, has come out of this enhanced and possibly leading her country to independence, while Johnson, who was the Tory leader who could reach the parts of the country that no other Tory leader could, his days are now being counted in months by some, and the question of certainly of whether he can see out the whole 5-year term is very open.
This disease, Carla, is affecting everything politically in any way. And in the summer, when Europe was looking across the Atlantic and said, look at these Americans, they don't know how to deal with this. And it was spiking at 60, 70,000 cases a day. By the way, we're spiking again. But now Europe overtaking the United States. Does that have any impact in the political debate here at home about this issue?
Well, the president has certainly tried to claim again and again that Europe is doing worse than we are. And sometimes he gets pushback from his interlocutors on this. Sometimes he doesn't. I think at this point, Americans aren't really spending a lot of time on the statistics. I think they see what they see in their own families. And I think this has become totally divided by American politics and totally consumed by the election. I think more than anything else, what's so extraordinary and such a reminder to Americans is you've had the president get sick. You've had so many people in the White House. Now Kamala Harris is communications director, somebody who was on the flight crew for Biden's plane. It is touching every part of the American political debate and remarkably does not seem to have changed the minds of the president or many of his supporters. Last night in the dueling debates, the president asserted that wearing a mask was actually dangerous at one point, just totally misrepresenting a study. So we're down a really bizarre Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole right now about this. So yeah, the president points to how bad things are in Europe, but it's politicized. I really don't think anybody's parsing the stats particularly well.
Ivo, if I could just weigh in on this one, because I have a slightly different, and again, anecdote is not the group of anecdote data, but we were doing a piece that actually published today on suburban women, how this is one of these swing votes that can be swayed to vote Republican on fiscal issues, but tends to vote Democratic on social issues. And we were reporting on how they were leaving Trump in droves. And it's one or two anecdotal, but we sort of called back some of the people we had interviewed just to make sure they're still shifting from Trump to Biden. And a couple of them said, actually, the European spike is making us rethink our vote because everyone blames Trump for what is going badly in the US. But if the Europeans can't do it, maybe it's not Trump's fault. So I don't think it's going to have a huge impact, but it was interesting to us to see that the European data may actually filter back into the US debate. Now, again, it's a couple of anecdotes and I don't want to make too much of it, but it's interesting that I would agree, if you'd asked me last week, I would have agreed with Carla on this because I don't think the European numbers really do have filtered into the American debate, but it struck me that we at least had a couple of data points there. The other thing I'll point out, and Ivo, or Giles, I think you were making this point, which is the extent to which political communication on this is really differentiated. It's sort of Macron has become the Andrew Cuomo of Europe, right? It shows that there's a way that if you speak about a bad thing correctly, you can take your people along. And Boris Johnson has not done that. And it's been interesting to see how being straight with your voters, I know as bizarre as that sounds, it should be a lesson for leaders right now. But if you're straight with your voters and you say, look, either I screwed this up or we tried this and it didn't work, but we're going to have to do this now, that your average voter will accept that and go along with you. And I think it's a real lesson for our political leadership in going forward on the pandemic.
So, Peter, I have a question. Those suburban women that you called, were they all FT readers?
No, they weren't actually. So,
just wondering.
Yeah. So there are not many in the Philadelphia suburbs, to be honest with you.
On this issue of trust and the ability of leaders to speak to their publics, of course, we're going to have the first election on a referendum, so to say, tomorrow, or actually today by our standards, in New Zealand, where we will see Jacinda Ardern, who has communicated as well as any leader probably has on this issue, probably get either close to or over 50% of the vote. First time that you will have a single party winning since the electoral system was changed there. So the politics plays in many ways, and as Peter says, being truthful probably is a good idea, just as Giles said. I want to get to the economic issue too, because it seems to me that part of the lesson that folks have, and Giles jump in here, is part of the lesson that people have learned that you can't do another lockdown, even though the epidemiology suggests that the only way you're ever going to really get control of this, as by the way, the New Zealanders just showed in Auckland, is you do shut it down and you take the economic hard case if you want to deal with disease. And if you don't, you just can't get it under control. But it doesn't seem to be that anyone in Europe, and frankly in the United States, of course, is even close to coming to that conclusion or acting on it. And what is the economic consequences of that?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And just picking up on that point about New Zealand, they have been able to act on the scientific advice and sequence it right, so that they did a complete lockdown and a shutdown of the borders. And this week, we're getting pictures tweeted out of full sports stadiums, a rugby match with real people, shoulder to shoulder, applauding a New Zealand try against Australian opposition, I think. In the whole of Europe, Germany and parts of Scandinavia, notable exceptions, but only to a degree, we have been off the pace, and we're now in a unenviable position for all leaders, however they're doing it in the polls, of having to trade off the health of the public and the health of the economy. And the difficulty in the UK seems to be that from March onwards, we've been at least 2 weeks late with every key decision. And so, whereas you would want to take the economic hit, a national or a partial shutdown, and then realize the economic benefits in the way that Ardern's government is being able to now in New Zealand, you're instead on the kind of seesaw that was predicted by the epidemiologists who said lockdown 2 weeks earlier. Just on the trust point, there's over-promising and under-delivering. Just a really specific example. Johnson has twigged that one way out of this might be to test everybody all the time. And he's called it a moonshot project. And he said he'll have it in place by the end of the year. Nobody believes him, probably with some justification. In the meantime, with almost no announcement, almost exactly that already exists in Italy, which has learned the lessons that we haven't learned over the summer. You get tested on arrival at the airport in Rome. All school kids are going to get the same testing. And I think we will find that kind of investment has an economic payoff down the road. But for the whole continent, 2021 looks dire economically.
I must say, just on that point, Giles, because what I've been struck by this is that we sort of frequently think in the U.S. we're slightly bizarro, ornery. You see these anti-mask protests and very libertarian. But what has struck me is that's emerging in Europe as well. I mean, in Spain in particular, the fight between Madrid and the central government over this. I mean, really nasty political infighting over this. Again, you mentioned Northern England, Manchester revolting against the center. They don't want to do, these lockdowns. The extent to which you have the assumption made in the U.S. is we are slightly odd and bizarre in that we resist lockdowns, but the lockdown fatigue is clearly a European phenomenon now as well, for the economic reasons that you were getting at, I think.
Yeah.
No,
I mean,
go ahead.
Just one point on sort of word usage. We spoke about a tsunami of infection at the start of this year. I think there's a general recognition now that we're facing a tsunami of unemployment. the end of this year and the beginning of next, as furlough schemes come to an end, government support tapers off. There is a strong feeling that what the Treasury has offered to support employers going into next year is not enough and not long enough, but there isn't the money either.
And we're seeing the same, of course, in the United States, with poverty rates now increasing, with the government help really having truly run out, and the economy really now taking on board what is happening in terms of COVID, unemployment numbers rising, poverty rising, and no end in sight to the political deadlock in Washington, Carla, on that issue.
Well, and there's also, there's the stimulus checks, which have disappeared, which have run out, and the decision that the Senate has made that it's going to race to confirm a new Supreme Court justice rather than make some sort of a decision on serious, they don't have the time to do both, a serious new stimulus. And one of the things that's missing more than anything else in this, serious discussion is what is going to happen to cities and states. I mean, the long-term impact on something like the MTA in New York City, the ability to move people around, get them back to their jobs when things pick up again, what's going to have to happen to, basic, ability to provide services, and these employ lots of people. And governments are going to have to lay people off, and they're not going to be able to build themselves back up even when people can go back to work, because the loss of billions and billions and billions of dollars and capacity here. And this is a long-term hit to the country, not just to individuals, but to the government, which employs individuals. And there is no serious discussion of this going on.
Well, Peter and I co-hosted a big event on the role of cities in COVID yesterday. And one of the figures we heard from the mayor of Pittsburgh was $350 billion less in revenue for cities just in the first 8 months of this year. We can go on for a long time on this issue. Let's move on, Carla, to another strange story, if I can put it that way. The prospect of a Trump-Putin summit before the election, so that's in the next 18 days, in order to sign a new nuclear arms control agreement. Tell us what this is about. Where's this story coming from? Is there any truth to it?
Oh boy, this is really complicated. So I'm going to try and crunch this down. Okay, so late last year, Putin made an offer that few, if any, American presidents would refuse. A no strings attached 5-year renewal of the New START agreement, which is the last nuclear arms control agreement left. Trump, of course, refused because he didn't want to extend something that Obama had negotiated. Instead, he wanted a Trumpian mega deal that would not just put a cap on long-range deployed strategic nuclear weapons. Okay, I won't get totally nerd-like here. He wanted to freeze everything, and he wanted to bring the Chinese into it too. This was undoubtedly this idea poison pill from John Bolton to kill off once and for all arms control deals. But Trump didn't see it that way. He honestly and truly, I think, believed he was going to, this one more time for him to get into the Nobel Peace Prize. So there was no chance this was going to happen. There wasn't time to negotiate a big deal with the Russians. And the Chinese were never going to show up at the table. The Chinese have 320 nuclear warheads. The Russians have between 4,000 and 6,000, depending on how you want to cut it. What are the Chinese going to do? Yes, I'm going to freeze in place 320, and you guys get to keep somewhere in the multi-thousands. This was an absurd idea. Certainly, I'd love to see a bigger Russian, U.S. deal, but this was never going to fly. So this week, meanwhile, the White House somehow seems to think they're still going to get some sort of a mega deal here. So this week, Trump's negotiator, Marshall Billingsley, announced they had an agreement in principle. They were going to extend this for 5 years, and they had a gentleman's agreement at the most top level to have a much bigger deal without the Chinese, but a much bigger deal with the Russians. Then the Russians started saying, I'm not just one Russian official. Every Russian official said, no, you're delusional. It's a dream. This is what you want. They were denying it on all sorts of levels. So the question becomes, did Putin pull a Lucy in the football? Did Trump misunderstand what Putin had to say? The deadline is February 5th, 15 days after the inauguration. even if they'd had an agreement, and let me add one more thing. Putin said this morning he'd go for a 1-year extension with no strings attached. Trump clearly wants something that he can roll out, but then his advisors are saying, do you really want to have Putin on the White House lawn right before the election, shaking your hands? Bottom line, if he's reelected and he throws away this New START extension, strategically, that's a disaster. From a drama point of view, it's just one more cock-up by this White House on national security.
Carla, I was curious if you could talk through the politics.
I warned you it was complicated.
No, it's a good story because I think, look, I mean, Biden has said he would have taken, and if he becomes president, he will take the 5-year extension.
Anybody would take the 5-year extension.
But I guess, I just want to poke you a little bit on the politics, because it is, to me, so bizarre. I mean, they're clearly so desperate for some sort of October surprise, right? You've got Hillary emails coming back up again. There's something to change the narrative. But I guess, again, you kind of answered this question, but is it a net positive to, even though you have an achievement, but it's Vladimir Putin, it's Russia. I mean, could you parse the politics domestically on this? I mean, do you think it's a positive at all? Or is there anything that he can gain from it?
Well, I think he believes, he keeps bringing up this notion, I was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for the UAE deal. I was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for North Korea. This was one more thing. He is trying to show that he is a great statesman as part of this. And I don't think he gets, it's a remarkable thing how little he understands how bad this relationship with Russia is for him domestically. I don't think he gets it the same way. I don't think he gets that this was a poison pill to begin with. I truly don't think he gets it. The tragedy or the danger in all this, of course, is if you let this New START extension, which all it takes, it doesn't have to be ratified. All you have to do is just sign on the dotted line. And of course, if Biden is elected, he will do it. If you let this slip away, in a few months, both the U.S. and Russia can upload. They've got it in their arsenal. They can upload 1,000 nuclear weapons on both sides, and we are back into a Cold War-style arms race. It's genuinely dangerous as well as just being bizarre.
I do think that part of the reason this is happening is because Trump has said, I have a good relationship with Putin, and this would be the proof that it's produced something positive. And I think in the end, he may well announce that we're going to extend the treaty without anything for 5 years and make that as the proof that there is something in that relationship. Giles, jump in here, but also this is arms control is a big issue in Europeans, and the machination that we're seeing is deeply uncomfortable. So address that as well, how this is looked at.
I want to start with the question, how does the 5-year deal, if it ever gets signed, accommodate Putin's love of grandstanding with new weapons? Am I right that would allow him to go ahead and experiment with this fancy hypersonic stuff that he uses, that plays so well at home, plays well with his own military, I don't know, appeals to his own machismo? Is he allowed to carry on experimenting with that?
I'm glad you asked that. You are appealing to my inner nerd. It's not that Putin loves deals. This is a guy who is trying to kill people with chemical weapons every other day. Not a great global actor here. They can't afford a continued arms race, and he really wanted this extension. So they said in April that New START would cover the exotic new technologies that they're doing, including the glide missile, hypersonic, and all these other things. So they can move ahead with it. There's nothing in New START that says that you can't build things. It's a numerical limitation. So there's going to be some sort of a trade-off here. He can develop technology, but keep in mind, we're developing new technology too. There's been an arms race going on within these caps, and that's something that one would hope that if Joe Biden is elected, that he would take a very serious look at. We're talking about spending $1 trillion on modernization ourselves. There's been an arms race going on since the Obama administration. And that's another question one should be asking Joe Biden, which is, are you going to go back to the status quo ante? Because that wasn't a pretty sight either. I
mean, to me, that is the thing that's being most interesting is to see how Biden resets the relationship if he becomes president. And I flew with Biden on this now famous trip to Kiev, and well, the big end of the trip at the time was to Tbilisi, to Georgia, because there were still Russian troops in South Ossetia. But what we know about Biden is he's actually much more anti-Russian than Obama was. Like, he was the guy who was sent to Ukraine and sent to Georgia to show that we still cared about the democracies on the periphery. And so we could really see a more of a sea change in U.S. Russia policy under a Biden administration. I think we much more hardline. Well, I guess hard not to be more hardline than Trump, but even more hardline, Clinton or Obama were on the issue of democracy promotion and sort of authoritarian in the near abroad. We have Belarus, we have Kyrgyzstan now. So it would be very interesting to see how a Biden administration handles Russia, and I suspect it's going to be much more hardline than even Obama was.
But you can be hardline on democracy, and at the same time you can negotiate a reduction of nuclear weapons. And Biden, I think, will push for, traditional arms control. The thing that I don't know is whether he's going to go forward with the fantasy of spending so much money on nuclear weapons that we particularly don't have after COVID. And one of the extraordinary things about this, every single presidential election that I have covered, I always got to write, this is where this president stands on national security. This is where this candidate stands on national security. We're not seeing those pieces because nobody's asking them these questions, because it's chaos out there and because there is no Trump administration policy to compare it to. So these guys haven't had to answer the questions.
Giles, loose from arms control, Peter's point that if Biden were to win, there would be a democracy and the near abroad would be seen as more getting more attention than it has in the Trump administration, for sure, but even in the Obama administration, we're also seeing a harder line emerging on Russia within Europe, and particularly in Germany after the Navalny incident, and there's now the incident, the poisoning of a opposition figure. Of course, do you sense, and in the UK, there's been a strong voice on Russia for quite a while, and because this poisoning of other people there. Do you have this sense that there may be a willingness to stand up more to Moscow and Putin in particular than might have been the case in the last sort of decade?
You know what? The short answer is no. That is, it is based on a few data points. I mean, you raised Navalny. And we should talk also about Belarus. Both appear to require a clear, prompt, timely, and straightforwardly pro-democratic, pro-freedom response from the EU. It hasn't come. The idea has been mooted that Nord Stream could be suspended or even scrapped in response to the spreading some nerve agent or tipping some nerve agent into Navalny's tea at a Siberian airport. Is that going to happen? I don't think so. You've got an entire economy of 80 million people largely dependent on Russian gas, massive investment in Nord Stream. Certainly, Gerhard Schroeder's position on the Russian side of that whole argument for many years is awkward and embarrassing for him as a former German chancellor. But Merkel has not indicated that she's minded to scrap Nord Stream herself, unless I've missed something. And now for 6 weeks, we've had daily demonstrations by really brave people on the streets of Minsk and elsewhere in Belarus. And coherent response from the EU, I don't see one. You're absolutely right that if there was one time in Theresa May's tenure that she got cross, as she would put it, in a compelling way, and mustered a lot of solidarity from the rest of the West, was after we had a little bit of Novichok in Salisbury, and the Skripals were poisoned, not killed, although a homeless woman died as a result.
Dawn Sturgis.
Right. Thank you for the name. But that seems to me to be the exception proving the rule. I mean, it's a slightly different point, but it's a point of a deep personal shame, the extent to which London and the UK more generally is susceptible to the charms of Russian money.
I mean, I must say, just to support Giles on this, I mean, Ivo, you and I were in Brussels when there were actually Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine, and the ability of the EU to twist itself in knots on this was just, embarrassing to behold, to be honest with you. I mean, you had Poles, you had the Baltics, who are full signed up members of both the EU and NATO, where you were, Ivo, begging, please, what's the point of joining these organizations if you're not going to support me when I have an existential threat on my borders? And you had the French and the Italians sort of, well, we have economic ties, we have, we can't do anything too rash. As Giles points out, the central player in this was always the Germans. And for reasons that I know frustrated, well, I don't want to speak for you, Ivo, I know that the Americans that I talked to at the time, incredibly frustrated on the issue of Nord Stream in other economic ties, which were clearly bypassing the Eastern Europeans to make peace with the Russians on their own. I mean, frankly, it remains, for me, the single biggest failure of European diplomacy over the last 10 years. I mean, it is shameful that they have put, they always blame the Americans for doing this, right? We always, all you care about is oil, all you care about, your foreign policy is driven by economic interests. I mean, please, the entire EU foreign policy approach to Russia has been about economic interests. And I just think it's a bit of a black mark on the EU's face right now.
I just want, I was just for the record, I was not in Brussels anymore when the Russians invaded Ukraine. In fact, I arrived after they invaded Georgia and left before they invaded Ukraine. The only time they didn't invade anybody.
You are a trailing economic indicator, clearly.
And I would like to think, Ivo, that had you been there, that the Obama response would have been a hell of a lot stronger, which raises a really interesting question for what Peter was talking about with Biden and what you were talking about, which is, if Biden is going to be more democracy promoted, is he going to try to pull a Maggie with George H.W. don't go all wobbly on me question and try to steal the Europeans' backbone on standing up? Yes, Trump hasn't done it. When Trump was asked about Navalny, what did he say? I'm negotiating a major nuclear deal with the Russians. Literally what he said, and hasn't said anything since. In fact, Navalny yesterday was pleading on CBS for Trump to say, this is a chemical weapons. It would be chemical weapon. Be nice if you denounced it. Would Biden be more able to steal the Europeans' backbone as well as the American backbone? Because Obama didn't push very hard either.
Well, the question about Biden is one we will maybe confront in a few weeks. Now, we're going to stick with this week's news. And Peter, let's move on to a topic we frankly haven't discussed, at least in this specific case, Thailand and the protest and the crackdown that is happening there. You know a little bit about the country. Your paper is reporting on it in a way that I think most American newspapers are not. So what's happening in Thailand? Why is this a big deal, and why should we care?
Well, let me try to explain why this should be an important issue for Americans and American foreign policy. And frankly, most Americans view Thailand as a place to go to the beaches. But Thailand has for decades been almost the most important military ally in the region. Remember when after September 11th, the dark sites where they were holding Al-Qaeda prisoners before Guantanamo Bay was in Thailand. I mean, that's how close the military relationship is and has been for a long time and remains so. The largest bilateral military exercises in the region, in Asia, are Thai-American exercises there. So this is one of those things that no one sort of pays attention to when it comes to Asia, but it's a key bilateral. It's a major non-ally, and we fund their military. We train their military. It is a key alliance for the Americans in the region, and yet we have seen Thailand move from what was frankly touted as an idealized and a model democracy in the region gradually over the last 10, 15 years to really what has gone from sort of managed democracy to almost authoritarianism. And we have sort of, I was on a trip there with Secretary Gates in which he stood with the Thai military and said, no more coups, please. But we've kind of sort of looked the other way as democratically elected leader after democratically elected leader has been overthrown by coups, and we've ignored sort of the people power in the streets. Now, the dynamic is basically this, and this is going to be an overgeneralization, but I'll make it anyway. Essentially, you have what are the Bangkok elites, the moneyed elites, the internationalists in Bangkok, who have for years been royalist, right? You had a king who died 4 years ago, incredibly popular, for all parts of Thai society. At the time of his death, was the longest serving monarch in the world. But everyone was very nervous of what happens when the king dies. His son is a little bit of a ne'er-do-well. Spent most of his life in Germany, a bit of a playboy, that kind of thing. The king was holding the society together. What would happen when the son took over? And sure enough, when the son took over, he sort of took the royal house's assets and made it his own. $40 billion, we think, worth of. He has suppressed the protest, and right now we've reached a bit of a crisis point. We've reached a point where, again, constant elections in Thailand have turned allies of Thaksin Shinawatra, who many people may remember, were this billionaire populist who kept getting elected by the non-Bangkok elites, the populist sort of rural areas. And every time he got a little bit too populist, the military came in and threw him out, and then he got sent out of the country, and then his sister got elected. And so we have a country here that has become edging on the edge of authoritarianism. And because of Trump, or because of we're so distracted by everything else, this is usually a place where American leadership to stand up and say, we are not tolerating this anymore. We're not tolerating a crackdown on peaceful student demonstrators now. They're mostly students. We don't tolerate this, but we've all forgotten about it. We're not paying attention to it. And frankly, because of the military ties and the pressure the Pentagon brings to maintain those military ties, Thailand's been able to go on in an increasingly repressive society and count on American alliance regardless. So I think it's one of those issues that, again, if we get a Biden presidency, is likely to move back to the front burner because we'll have a more normal foreign policy. And frankly, I just wish that the U.S. foreign policy establishment would pay more attention to it, because it is one of those places where the U.S. could have a key impact. Now, one last thing on this. Clearly, other than the military ties we have with Thailand, the other thing that's weighing on American foreign policy is China. And there is a nervousness that anyone in the region who we decide to be a little tough with is going to move into the Chinese sphere. And that is a genuine concern, I think, with Thailand. The Thais have been much more, I won't say welcoming, but open to ties with the Chinese than, say, even Myanmar or some of our, some of our more traditional allies like the Japanese or others in the region. So that is a concern. But I do think there comes a time when American foreign policy has to both be principled as well as interest. And Thailand has been one of those places for years now, and we just haven't done it.
And Carla, just let's open the aperture a little bit from what Peter's saying and take that last point about the competition with China. Thailand, of course, a member of ASEAN, a very important, the Association of Southeastern Asian nations, with Singapore and sort of ally, Philippines, a real bilateral ally, Cambodia, Vietnam, really important countries economically, politically, even militarily in the region, and the South China Sea, a competition with China on this. What's the geostrategic argument, in addition to the democracy argument that Peter and the military alliance argument? What's the geostrategic argument to pay attention to this region?
Well, I knew absolutely nothing about Thailand. So, Peter, I would like to thank you for that. I was going to go the fact that the last time President Trump mentioned it, he pronounced it Thailand, which is true. But listen, this is these countries themselves, because of the ASEAN way, are incapable of acting together as a group. Which is why Myanmar was allowed to go so far down the road that it went. This notion of counterbalancing, if there were a stated coherent policy for the Trump administration, a more normal foreign policy, there was a while there when it looked like when they were cultivating India, when it looked like they did have an actual counterbalancing strategy for China, which is really not a bad strategy. But that's sort of, you don't see a lot of attention being paid to it.
I mean, the absenting ourselves from the region for 4 years is going to have the chickens are going home and roost on that one. I mean, again, thinking about trips I have taken to the region, I think this was a Rumsfeld trip where we went to Tokyo, we went to Sydney, we went to Seoul, and every single conversation was, please give us the F-22 because we need to prepare ourselves to fight against the Chinese. And they saw the U.S. because of its commitment to be present in the Pacific as the power that would protect them from the Chinese. And we have absented ourselves for 4 years, which means every power in the region has been forced to rethink their calculus. Can I rely on the Americans anymore? Or do I have to sue for peace or sue for some sort of, you've seen this with the Philippines, with Duterte, right? This was in many ways one of the closest American allies within ASEAN, and they were fighting the good fight on the South China Sea. And now they've gone all in with Beijing. And I think there is going to be a reckoning, and it'll be interesting to see how Biden plays this. But the fact that we have failed to pay attention to this region, I think, is going to really hurt us in the near term, frankly.
Giles, jump in here, and particularly on the region, but also, if you want, on the phenomenon of street protest.
Yeah.
Really coming forward, not only in that region, but of course you mentioned Belarus and other places.
Yeah. I'm afraid I'm with Carla. I've never reported from Thailand, but I really wanted to bring something to the table on this. So I was fascinated by, what is it? Is it 60 or 600,000 young Thai people who've been on the streets? But their salute, right, is from the Hunger Games.
Yes, I saw that. I love that.
Yeah. So I went to IMDb hoping that you would see an exponential tick up in box office revenue as those 3 movies came out in Thailand. The numbers, unfortunately, are quite low. Certainly, by global standards, 3.3 million for part 1, 2.7 million US for part 2. So it's obviously resonated maybe on illegal streaming networks, but it's resonated for another reason. But first of all credit to them. And I speak, let me cards on the table, as a British Republican, lowercase r. And I wish we could have an open and honest debate about royalty and shatter some taboos, just as they have over there. But Ivo, to your broader point about street protest, when people risk their lives or risk incarceration in the name of freedom broadly defined against tyranny broadly defined, I think it is incumbent on Western governments at least to ask themselves whether they should be involved. That question is posed by Belarus, as you say. It's also posed by Kyrgyzstan, which is my favorite country in the world. I commend it to you once it gets more peaceful. I'm sure, Peter and Carla, you've been there.
I've been to the Bishkek Hilton. I won $100 at the Bishkek Hilton casino, yes.
Oh my goodness. You should get out and about in Kyrgyzstan. It doesn't get better than that. I am fascinated by the unrest on the whole periphery or much of the periphery of the former Soviet space. Let's not forget the Russian Far East, which is technically within Russian national borders, but what's happening in Khabarovsk over there is almost akin to Belarus at the other end of the country. And how there's a feeling that everything's in abeyance pending the 3rd of November. It'll be really interesting to see if the US State Department, under a new president, if there is one, can staff up quickly enough to actually recast foreign policy so that it makes a difference.
Ivo, can I just make one more point on this? I know I'm dominating this session, but I do feel very strongly about this because I think I don't want this risk a little bit becoming a Trump bashing session, but I would just point out that the decline in America's willingness to intervene on street protests predates Trump, right? Obama, the green protests in Iran, that's an Iranian thing. We're not going to intervene. And to be honest with you, this started, I think, in sort of the post George W. Bush, neoconservative. When the neoconservatives said we have to make the world safe for democracy at a point of a gun, and the fact that we want to do pro-human rights and pro-democracy through war, the whole concept, I think, in the U.S. foreign policy establishment of democracy promotion was damaged, and damaged perhaps for a long time. And clearly, the Obama administration started that. There was very little willingness within the Obama White House to back street protests, democracy movements anywhere. And I think in many ways, Trump is the metastasized extension of that. So I don't want to make this all about Trump. And I to Giles' point, whether a Biden administration would change that, Biden does come from much more the liberal internationalist wing of the Democratic Party. And in many ways, there was some tension within the Obama administration because of that. You saw within the vice president's office a much more sort of struggling, please, can we say more about Georgia? Can we say more about Ukraine? So it could change, but I would just say that there is much less willingness amongst the American people for the backing, be it of Belarusians or be it Thais or be it anyone who's now taking to the streets in hopes of getting American support for democracy.
So Peter, one thing here, which is I do think you're going to see if Biden's elected, a much more traditional. I went and looked at what the Trump administration had to say about Nagorno-Karabakh versus what the Biden statement on it. And the Biden statement is a very traditional, in many ways, pre-Obama Democratic, president statement. The Trump administration must tell Azerbaijan that it will not tolerate its efforts. It must make clear to Armenia that regions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh cannot be occupied indefinitely. It's very strong, traditional American, it doesn't say we're sending in troops, but probably stronger than what you would have heard from the Trump administration. But we'll see.
Well,
certainly or from the Obama administration. Sorry, I meant Obama.
We will get to the question of the Biden administration.
Sorry, Ivo. We're all so forward. We're pitching forward, as we like to say in journalism.
That makes sense. I would note, while I fully agree with both Carla and Peter's view on the Obama administration and these kinds of issues, there was one exception. It was the Arab Spring. And the beginning of the Arab Spring, but the support for the ouster and the stepping down of Mubarak. But the lesson learned was that doesn't necessarily lead to democracy, and therefore, when Syria happened, less support was given. But the larger point, and I think we will come back to this over and over again, and Thailand just happens to underscore it this week, there are a lot of people who are willing to go out on the street and face crackdowns from law enforcement and military folks in order to support freedom. And the question of how Western powers react to that will be with us, I think, for many months and years to come. A fascinating discussion. Peter Spiegel, Carla Robbins, Giles Whittell, thanks so much for joining us today, this week.